In August 1973, Sheriff Daniel Thornton vanished from the streets of Esperanza, Texas, a town of 8,000 souls where everyone knew everyone's business. The 35-year-old lawman disappeared after his evening shift, his patrol car found idling outside the county courthouse with the door hanging open and his service weapon still holstered inside. 46 years would pass before genetic genealogy cracked the case wide open. In 2019, investigators matched DNA from beneath the sheriff's fingernails to someone whose connection to the victim would shake Esperanza to its foundation. What made the case truly haunting was this. The person responsible had attended Daniel's memorial service, had consoled his widow, and had lived among them for decades afterward, hiding in plain sight behind a carefully constructed mask. If you want to hear more shocking cold cases like this, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story about justice finally served. The maintenance worker found the patrol car at 11:47 p.m. on August 14, 1973. Tommy Rodriguez had been locking up the courthouse when he noticed the Dodge Monaco sitting in the darkness, engine running, headlights cutting yellow beams across the empty square. The driver's door stood open like a question mark. Tommy approached slowly, his keys jangling in the humid night air. Through the windshield, he could see the radio crackling softly, the dispatcher's voice asking if anyone had a 1020 on Unit 1. The sheriff's Stetson lay on the passenger seat. His clipboard rested on the dashboard, a half-finished incident report still clipped to it. But no Daniel Thornton. Tommy ran to the payphone outside Harmon's drugstore and dialed the sheriff's department. Deputy Frank Castillo answered on the first ring. "Frank, it's Tommy Rodriguez. You need to get down to the courthouse right now. The sheriff's car is here, but he ain't." 15 minutes later, the square blazed with red and blue lights. Deputies fanned out across downtown Esperanza, flashlights sweeping through alleys and doorways. They found nothing. No signs of struggle, no blood, no shell casings. Just that idling patrol car with everything exactly where it should be, except for the man himself. Deputy Castillo made the call to Daniel's house at 12:30 a.m. Margaret Thornton had been asleep when the phone rang, her 6-year-old daughter curled up next to her after a nightmare about monsters under the bed. The moment she heard Frank's voice, tight with something between confusion and fear, Margaret knew something terrible had happened. She arrived at the courthouse in her nightgown and a borrowed jacket. Her daughter left with a neighbor. The patrol car had been towed to the station by then, but she could see the spot where it had been parked, marked now with police tape that fluttered in the hot breeze blowing off the Rio Grande 20 miles south. "His gun's still there," Frank told her quietly. "His wallet, too. Badge still pinned to his shirt, hanging on the hook in the back. Radio works fine. We've been calling, but nobody answered." Margaret stared at the empty parking space. Daniel had been a lawman for 12 years, sheriff for the last 3. He knew every criminal in Hidalgo County by name, knew their families, knew which ones would talk and which ones would fight. He'd never once left his post without telling someone where he was going. "He was meeting someone," she said. "What makes you say that?" "Because Daniel never just stopped in the middle of patrol. If he parked the car and got out, he had a reason. He was meeting someone he knew." The investigation began in earnest the next morning. Texas Rangers arrived from Austin, bringing expertise and resources that the small sheriff's department lacked. They interviewed every resident within 6 blocks of the courthouse. They pulled every arrest record Daniel had filed in the past year. They questioned known troublemakers, drug dealers, anyone who might have held a grudge against the sheriff. One name kept surfacing: Hector Vega, a small-time marijuana dealer Daniel had busted 4 times in the past 18 months, Hector's brother, Carlos, had died in county jail the previous year during a fight with another inmate. Some people whispered that Hector blamed Daniel for not keeping Carlos safe, that he'd been heard saying the sheriff would pay for his brother's death. Rangers brought Hector in for questioning. He'd been at a poker game in Edinburgh that night, surrounded by witnesses who all swore he never left the table. His truck had been parked outside the host's house from 7 p.m. until 2 a.m. His alibi held up like concrete. Investigators searched the Rio Grande, thinking maybe Daniel had been forced into a car and driven to the river, but the August drought had the water low and slow. Divers found nothing but trash and catfish. They dragged Lake Esperanza. Nothing. They searched abandoned buildings, old wells, the cotton fields that stretched for miles beyond the town limits. Nothing. Daniel Thornton had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. Margaret held a press conference 1 week after the disappearance. She stood on the courthouse steps in a black dress, her daughter's hand gripped tightly in hers, and pleaded into the cameras for information. Someone had to have seen something. Someone had to know. "My husband was a good man," she said, her voice steady despite the tears running down her face. "He served this community with honor. He has a little girl who needs her father. Please, if you know anything at all, come forward." The tips flooded in. Someone had seen a suspicious car near the courthouse. Someone else had heard gunshots that night. Another caller insisted Daniel had been having an affair and had run off with his mistress. Every lead evaporated under scrutiny. 3 weeks after the disappearance, the Thornton family buried an empty casket. Margaret had fought against it, insisting that Daniel was still out there somewhere, that they needed to keep looking. But her parents convinced her that their daughter needed closure, needed to understand that Daddy wasn't coming home. The church overflowed with mourners. Deputies from across South Texas came in full dress uniform. The mayor gave a eulogy. A mariachi band played Amazing Grace in Spanish, the way Daniel had always preferred it. People filed past the closed casket, many of them weeping openly, remembering the young sheriff who'd grown up among them, who'd played football for Esperanza High, who'd married his high school sweetheart and come home after a stint in Vietnam to serve his community. One man stood near the back of the church throughout the service, hat in hand, face somber. Wayne Hollister had moved to Esperanza 3 years earlier, taking a job as an accountant for the region's cotton cooperatives. He'd become friendly with Daniel over coffee at the Bluebonnet Café, where they'd talk about the town, about Wayne's adjustment to small-town life after growing up in Houston, about Daniel's collection of antique revolvers that he kept locked in a safe at home. Wayne approached Margaret after the service, his eyes red-rimmed behind thick glasses. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Thornton. Daniel was a fine man. If there's anything I can do to help your family, anything at all, please let me know." Margaret thanked him, too numb with grief to register much beyond the condolences that washed over her in an unending wave. Daniel Thornton's last day alive had started like any other Tuesday in August. He'd woken at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of the alarm clock beside his bed, Margaret already awake and making coffee in the kitchen. The house smelled like chorizo and eggs, breakfast tacos warming on the stove. Their daughter, Emily, was still asleep in her room, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight against her chest. Daniel showered and dressed in his uniform, the khaki shirt pressed sharp with military creases, the badge polished until it gleamed. Margaret had learned to press his uniforms the way the Army had taught him during his 2 tours in Vietnam. Some habits never left you. Over breakfast, they'd talked about ordinary things. Emily needed new shoes for school, which started in 3 weeks. The air conditioner was making a rattling sound again. Margaret's mother was coming for dinner on Friday and wanted to know if Daniel could pick up her prescription from the pharmacy. Another exciting day in the life of Sheriff Thornton, Daniel had joked, kissing Margaret goodbye at 6:45 a.m. "Be careful out there," she'd said, the same thing she said every morning. She'd been saying it since before Vietnam, since before they got married, since they were teenagers, and he'd joined the football team against his mother's wishes. "Always am," he'd replied, same as always. Daniel's morning had been routine paperwork at the office, reviewing incident reports from the night shift. A drunk and disorderly at the Purple Cactus Bar. A domestic disturbance on Mesquite Street that had been resolved without arrests. A suspicious vehicle parked behind the high school that turned out to belong to a teacher working late. Around 10 a.m., he'd driven patrol through downtown, waving at shop owners opening their stores. He'd stopped at the Bluebonnet Café for coffee and a piece of Loretta's famous pecan pie. The owner's son, Marcus, was leaving for college in Austin next week, and Daniel had given him advice about staying out of trouble in the big city. "You got a good head on your shoulders," Daniel had told the 18-year-old. "Use it. Don't let anyone pressure you into doing something you know is wrong." At noon, Daniel had lunch with his deputies at the office. They'd ordered sandwiches from the deli and eaten in the break room, discussing the upcoming county fair and which deputy would be stuck working crowd control. Frank Castillo volunteered, which surprised everyone until he admitted he'd been sweet on the woman running the preserve's competition booth. The afternoon brought 2 fender benders, both on Highway 83 where the sun glare made it hard to see brake lights. Daniel had worked both accidents himself, filling out reports, taking measurements, making sure everyone was okay. Nobody seriously hurt, just bent metal and bruised egos. Around 5 p.m., he'd stopped by the elementary school where Margaret worked. She was decorating her classroom for the new school year, hanging alphabet charts and multiplication tables. Daniel had helped her reach the high spots, standing on a ladder while she handed him thumbtacks. "You coming home for dinner?" she'd asked. "Probably around 8. Got evening patrol, but I'll try to wrap up early." He'd kissed her goodbye again, not knowing it would be the last time. Evening patrol started at 6 p.m. Daniel drove his usual route through the neighborhoods on the east side of town, checking for anything unusual. He'd spotted old Mr. Hernandez struggling to change a tire on his truck and stopped to help, getting his uniform dirty with road dust and grease. Mr. Hernandez had tried to pay him, but Daniel waved it off. "That's what neighbors do," Daniel had said. At 7:30 p.m., Daniel had radioed the station to report all clear in his sector. His voice had been calm, unhurried, everything normal. At 8:15 p.m., dispatch had tried to raise him on the radio. No response. At 8:47 p.m., they'd tried again. Still nothing. At 9:30 p.m., Frank Castillo had driven Daniel's usual patrol route, looking for the Dodge Monaco. Nothing. At 11:47 p.m., Tommy Rodriguez found the abandoned patrol car. Between 7:30 p.m. and 11:47 p.m., Daniel Thornton had been murdered and buried in a cotton field a mile and a half from the courthouse. The 4 hours between his last radio check and the discovery of his empty car would haunt investigators for 46 years. The Texas Rangers worked the case with intensity rarely seen in rural South Texas. Lead investigator Captain James Morrison brought a team of 8 agents from Austin, setting up a command post in the sheriff's department conference room. They covered the walls with maps, timelines, photographs, every scrap of information they could gather. Morrison interviewed Margaret for 6 hours over 2 days, going through every detail of Daniel's life. Did he have any enemies? Had he mentioned anyone acting strange? Had he received any threats? Margaret answered every question carefully, desperately trying to remember anything that might help. There was one thing. she'd said on the second day, her voice hoarse from crying. About 2 weeks ago, Daniel said someone had been watching the house. He thought he saw a car parked down the street late at night. Same car 2 nights in a row. A dark sedan, maybe blue or black. But when he went out to check, it drove away. Morrison leaned forward. Did he get a plate number? No. It was too far away, too dark. He figured it was probably nothing, maybe someone visiting a neighbor. But I remember he seemed bothered by it. The Rangers spent days trying to track down that dark sedan. They interviewed every neighbor within 6 blocks, asking if anyone owned or had seen such a vehicle. Nothing concrete emerged. They pulled every case Daniel had worked in his 3 years as sheriff, looking for someone who might want revenge. They found plenty of people Daniel had arrested, but most were small-time offenders, drug dealers, thieves, drunk drivers. None of them seemed capable of the planning and coldness required to ambush and kill a sheriff. Hector Vega remained their prime suspect for 2 weeks, despite his solid alibi. Morrison had a theory. Maybe Hector hadn't pulled the trigger himself, but he'd hired someone to do it. They traced Hector's finances, his phone records, his movements in the weeks leading up to August 14th. Nothing. No suspicious payments, no contact with anyone who could be a hitman. Finally, Morrison had to admit what everyone else already knew. Hector Vega hadn't killed Sheriff Thornton. The investigation expanded beyond Esperanza. Rangers contacted law enforcement agencies across South Texas, asking if they had any cases that might connect to Daniel's disappearance. They looked at unsolved murders, missing persons, any crime that showed a similar MO. They found nothing that fit. 3 weeks into the investigation, a psychic from San Antonio called the sheriff's department, claiming she'd had a vision of Daniel's body near water, surrounded by cotton. The Rangers rolled their eyes but followed up anyway, dragging the irrigation canals that crisscrossed the cotton fields around Esperanza. They found old tires, shopping carts, a rusted washing machine. No body. Margaret received dozens of letters from psychics and amateur detectives across the country, all claiming to know what happened to her husband. Some said he'd been abducted by aliens. Others insisted he'd witnessed something corrupt and been killed to keep him quiet. One particularly cruel letter suggested Daniel had faked his death to start a new life with a mistress in Mexico. Frank Castillo screened these letters before Margaret could see most of them, but a few slipped through. The worst one came from someone claiming to be the killer, describing in graphic detail what they'd done to Daniel. The Rangers traced it to a teenager in Oklahoma who thought it was funny to torment a widow. He was arrested and charged with harassment. By October, the search had wound down. The Rangers had conducted over 300 interviews, followed up on more than 500 tips, and searched thousands of acres around Esperanza. They'd found nothing. Captain Morrison held a final briefing with the sheriff's department before returning to Austin. "This case isn't closed," Morrison told them. "It's just paused. We're waiting for new information, a new lead. Someone out there knows what happened. Someday, they'll talk, or we'll find physical evidence. Cases like this don't stay unsolved forever." But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. The case went cold. Frank Castillo became sheriff officially after a special election in November 1973. He won by a landslide, running on the promise that he'd never stop looking for Daniel. And he didn't. Every few months, he'd pull out the case file and go through it again, looking for something everyone had missed. He'd drive out to the places they'd searched, hoping maybe the body had surfaced, maybe the dirt had shifted. On the first anniversary of the disappearance, Frank organized a candlelight vigil in the town square. Hundreds of people came, holding candles and singing hymns. Margaret stood at the front with Emily, now 7 years old, and still asking when Daddy was coming home. "Your daddy was a hero," Frank told Emily that night. "He protected people. He made sure everyone in this town was safe. And someday, we're going to find out what happened to him. I promise you that." It was a promise Frank would never personally fulfill, but he kept trying until the day he retired in 1993. His replacement, Sheriff Gloria Martinez, inherited the cold case file and added her own notes to it over the years. Then came Sheriff Bobby Chen in 2005, and finally Sheriff Thomas Ramirez in 2015. Each one kept the file active, kept it on their desk, kept the memory of Daniel Thornton alive. But as the years passed, fewer people in Esperanza remembered the vanished sheriff. New residents moved in, people who'd never known Daniel Thornton, who'd never seen the search parties comb the fields, who'd never felt the community's collective grief. The case became history, then legend, then just another story about the old days. Margaret never remarried, though she had offers. A lawyer from McAllen had courted her in the early 1980s, a good man who treated Emily like his own daughter. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to move forward without knowing what happened to Daniel. She felt like she'd be abandoning him somehow, giving up hope. She raised Emily alone, working her job at the school and taking accounting classes at night to make extra money doing taxes during tax season. Emily grew up quiet and serious, always aware that she was the girl whose father disappeared. Kids at school whispered about it. Teachers gave her sympathetic looks. It shaped who she became. Emily left Esperanza as soon as she graduated high school, moving to Dallas for college and then to Houston for work. She loved her mother, but couldn't stand the weight of the unanswered questions that hung over everything in that small town. She married, had children of her own, built a life far away from the place where her father had vanished. Margaret stayed. Esperanza was home. Daniel was buried somewhere in this ground. She was certain of it, and she wouldn't leave him alone in the dark. Wayne Hollister watched all of this unfold from his quiet life on the edge of town. He attended the candlelight vigils, always standing near the back. He brought casseroles to Margaret's house in the months after the disappearance, checking in on her, offering to help with yard work or repairs. He coached Emily's Little League softball team one summer, teaching her how to hit a curveball. He became exactly what he appeared to be: a good neighbor, a reliable friend, a pillar of the community. He served on the city council for 2 terms in the 1980s. He was president of the Esperanza Rotary Club. He volunteered at the food bank every Thanksgiving, serving meals to families in need. Nobody suspected Wayne Hollister of anything more sinister than being occasionally boring at dinner parties, where he'd drone on about tax law and municipal budgets. His wife Sandra loved him, or thought she did. Their children grew up well-adjusted and successful. Their house on Magnolia Street was always the best decorated for Christmas, with lights and inflatable Santas and a life-size nativity scene in the front yard. But late at night, when Sandra was asleep, Wayne would sometimes drive out to the place where he'd buried Daniel Thornton. The cotton field had been converted to a solar farm in the 1990s, panels covering acres of what used to be farmland. Wayne would park on the old access road and stare out at the rows of panels, knowing Daniel was somewhere beneath them, hidden forever. He never felt guilt exactly. What he felt was more like relief that he'd gotten away with it, mixed with a constant low-grade anxiety that someday, somehow, the truth would surface. Every time a new forensic technique made the news, every time he heard about a cold case being solved, Wayne's heart would race for a few minutes before he calmed himself down. They didn't have his DNA on file. They didn't have any evidence connecting him to the crime. He'd been so careful, until he wasn't careful enough. Margaret never remarried. She raised their daughter alone, working as a secretary at the elementary school to make ends meet. On the anniversary of Daniel's disappearance each year, she placed flowers at the empty grave in the Catholic cemetery on the edge of town. She never stopped believing that someday, somehow, she would learn the truth about what happened to her husband. Wayne Hollister remained in Esperanza, becoming a pillar of the community. He served on the school board. He coached Little League. He volunteered with the volunteer fire department. He married a local woman, a teacher named Sandra, and they had 2 children together. By all accounts, Wayne Hollister was exactly what he appeared to be, a quiet, reliable man who'd found his place in a small Texas town. In the autumn of 2018, a crew from the Texas Department of Transportation was clearing land for a new highway bypass around Esperanza when the bulldozer blade struck something solid. The operator, Miguel Santos, had been working heavy machinery for 20 years and knew the difference between hitting a rock and hitting something man-made. He climbed down from the cab, wiped sweat from his forehead in the October heat, and walked over to investigate. What he'd uncovered looked like the rusted corner of an old water tank, half buried in the caliche soil. Miguel called over his foreman, Jerry Hutchins, and they debated whether to just dig it out and toss it aside or report it to the county. Something about it bothered Miguel. The metal was corroded, but the shape wasn't quite right for a water tank. "Let's dig around it a bit," Jerry suggested. "If it's a tank, we'll pull it out. If it's something else, well, we'll deal with that then." They brought in a smaller excavator and carefully scraped away the soil. What they uncovered made both men step back from the hole. Bones, human bones, clothed in fragments of what had once been a uniform. Jerry radioed the highway department office, and within 20 minutes, the site was swarming with law enforcement. Sheriff Thomas Ramirez arrived first, took one look at the excavation, and immediately secured the scene. He called the Texas Rangers, called the county medical examiner, called everyone who needed to be called when you found human remains that might be connected to a crime. The remains were largely skeletal, the soft tissue long since decomposed in the dry Texas soil, but fragments of uniform remained, preserved by the buttons and belt buckle that had pressed against the fabric for 45 years. The buttons bore the Hidalgo County Sheriff's insignia. The badge, tarnished green with age, was still attached to the shirt pocket. The leather gun belt, cracked and brittle, still bore the stamp of the Austin company that had manufactured it in the 1960s. The skull showed obvious trauma, a depressed fracture at the back, the occipital bone shattered by a single devastating blow. The force had been tremendous, enough to kill instantly. Nearby, half buried in the same soil, investigators found a length of pipe. It was corroded nearly through, but still intact enough to see that one end had been capped. Tool marks on the pipe suggested it had been cut from a longer section, probably in someone's garage workshop. Dr. Helen Vasquez, the forensic anthropologist from UT Austin who responded to the scene, spent 3 days carefully excavating the grave. She worked with brushes and hand tools, photographing and documenting every inch of the burial site. The grave was shallow, only 4 feet deep, and showed signs of hasty construction. The body had been placed face down, arms at the sides. No attempt had been made to prepare the body or show any respect. This was disposal, pure and simple. The burial method tells us a lot, Dr. Vasquez explained to Detective Sarah Mendoza, who'd been assigned the case. This wasn't ritualistic. The killer didn't care about the victim beyond hiding the evidence. The shallow depth suggests time pressure or physical limitations. Digging a grave is hard work. 4 feet was enough to hide the body, so the killer stopped there. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office in Austin for formal analysis. Dr. Patricia Chen, the chief medical examiner, confirmed what everyone already suspected. The victim was male, approximately 30 to 40 years old at time of death, 5 foot 10 inches tall, died from blunt force trauma to the posterior skull. Time since death was estimated at 40 to 50 years, based on bone degradation and the condition of the grave artifacts. But the real breakthrough came during evidence collection. Dr. Chen's team carefully scraped beneath the fingernails of the skeleton's right hand, looking for any preserved biological material. In cold cases, this was often a lost cause. DNA degraded over time, especially in shallow graves exposed to groundwater and soil bacteria. But Texas soil was dry, the grave was slightly elevated on a hillside, and the pipe that had fallen across the body had created a small air pocket that had helped preserve the hands. Beneath the nails of 3 fingers on the right hand, Dr. Chen found microscopic traces of skin cells, 45-year-old skin cells, but intact enough for DNA extraction. "This is remarkable preservation," Dr. Chen told Detective Mendoza over the phone. "The soil conditions were perfect, dry, slightly alkaline, minimal bacterial activity. I've extracted enough cellular material to generate a full DNA profile. If this person is in CODIS, we'll have our killer." The DNA profile was entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, the national database of criminal offenders. The computer ran for 30 seconds, comparing the unknown profile against millions of known samples. No match. Whoever killed the person buried in that cotton field had never been arrested for a violent felony, had never submitted DNA to law enforcement, had never been in the military after DNA collection became standard. They were a ghost. Detective Mendoza stared at the no-match result on her computer screen and felt frustration wash over her. They had the killer's DNA, the one piece of evidence that could definitively identify a perpetrator. And it was useless because the person wasn't in the system. Then she remembered an article she'd read in the Austin American-Statesman 6 months earlier about the Golden State Killer case. Joseph DeAngelo had been caught not through traditional DNA databases, but through genetic genealogy, comparing crime scene DNA to profiles on public ancestry websites. It was revolutionary, and police departments across the country were starting to use the technique. Mendoza called the Hidalgo County District Attorney, laid out the situation, and asked for permission to send the DNA to Parabon Nanolabs, a private company that specialized in forensic genetic genealogy. The DA approved it immediately. This was the biggest cold case in county history. If genetic genealogy could solve it, they had to try. The DNA profile arrived at Parabon's offices in Virginia in December 2018. Dr. Ellen Horn, the company's lead genetic genealogist, uploaded it to GEDmatch in early January 2019. GEDmatch was a public database where people uploaded their raw DNA data from consumer tests like 23andMe and Ancestry, hoping to find relatives. The database contained over 1 million profiles, a massive family tree waiting to be pieced together. The unknown killer's profile matched 127 people in the database at varying degrees of relationship. The closest matches were third and fourth cousins, people who shared a great-great-grandparent with the killer. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Dr. Horn began building family trees backward from those 127 matches. She worked methodically, using birth records, marriage certificates, death notices, census data, obituaries, church records, anything that documented family relationships. She subscribed to a dozen genealogy websites, spending 12 hours a day tracing bloodlines back through generations. The work was painstaking. A single typo in a name, a mistaken date, a wrong assumption about a relationship could send her down a rabbit hole that wasted days. But Dr. Horn was patient and thorough. She'd solved 40 cold cases using genetic genealogy over the past 3 years. She knew how to do this. After 3 weeks, a pattern emerged. Most of the DNA matches descended from a couple named Johann and Greta Hollister, who'd immigrated to Texas from Germany in the 1840s. They'd settled in the Galveston area, had 9 children who survived to adulthood, and those children had spread across Texas, creating a sprawling family tree with hundreds of branches. Dr. Horn built out the complete Hollister family tree, accounting for every descendant she could find through 7 generations. Then she began filtering. The unknown killer was male based on the Y chromosome analysis. He would have been alive in 1973, probably between 20 and 60 years old, based on the physical effort required to kill someone and bury them. And he would have been in or near Esperanza, Texas, in August 1973. The pool narrowed dramatically. 3 men fit all the parameters. Robert James Hollister, born 1932, lived in Corpus Christi. He died in 1989 from lung cancer. Ruled out. Carl Edward Hollister, born 1948, lived in San Diego, California, in 1973. His military records placed him on a Navy ship in the Pacific Ocean in August 1973. Ruled out. Wayne Edward Hollister, born 1941, moved to Esperanza, Texas, in 1970. Still alive, age 78, resident of Esperanza. Dr. Horn called Detective Mendoza with her findings on March 15, 2019. Mendoza listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions about the certainty of the genetic match. "How confident are you that this is our guy?" Mendoza asked. "The genetic evidence puts him in the right family cluster with 99.9% certainty," Dr. Horn replied. "Combined with the geographic and age filters, I'd say we're looking at 99.5% probability that Wayne Edward Hollister is your killer. But you'll want to confirm with a direct DNA sample from him. Get his coffee cup, a cigarette butt, something." Mendoza pulled up Wayne Hollister's basic information. Clean record, no arrests, not even a traffic ticket. Retired accountant, married, 2 grown children, volunteer firefighter, model citizen. She felt her instincts prickle. Model citizens didn't kill sheriffs and bury them in cotton fields. But then again, people who killed sheriffs and got away with it for 46 years were exactly the kind of people who could maintain a perfect facade for decades. The highway crew had discovered Sheriff Daniel Thornton. The case landed on the desk of Detective Sarah Mendoza, who'd been born 3 years after Daniel's disappearance, but had grown up hearing the story. Her own grandfather had been one of the deputies who'd searched for the sheriff back in 1973. She approached the investigation with the determination of someone who understood what closure meant for a community that had carried this wound for nearly half a century. First thing we did was secure the scene and bring in forensic anthropologists from UT Austin, Sarah would later testify. We documented everything exactly as it was found. The location was significant. It was only 1.5 miles from the courthouse, off an old farm road that doesn't exist anymore. In 1973, this was cotton fields owned by the Esperanza Cooperative. The remains went to the medical examiner in Austin for analysis. DNA confirmed the identity. Daniel James Thornton, age 35 at time of death, killed by blunt force trauma to the occipital bone. The angle of the blow suggested the killer had been standing directly behind him when they struck. The sheriff had never seen it coming. But the real breakthrough came from evidence that 1973 technology couldn't have processed. DNA extracted from beneath Daniel's fingernails. He'd fought back, just for a moment, scratching his attacker's forearm or neck hard enough to collect skin cells that had been preserved by the dry Texas soil for 45 years. That DNA profile went into CODIS, the FBI's national database. No matches. Whoever killed Daniel Thornton had never been arrested for a violent crime, had never submitted DNA to law enforcement. But Detective Mendoza had been following developments in genetic genealogy with interest, watching cases like the Golden State Killer get solved through DNA uploaded to public ancestry websites. She reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specialized in forensic genetic genealogy, and asked if they could help. In March 2019, Parabon uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public database where people shared their genetic information in hopes of finding relatives. The profile matched dozens of distant cousins, most of them descended from German immigrants who'd settled in Texas in the 1840s. Dr. Ellen Horn, Parabon's lead genetic genealogist, built family trees backward from those matches, constructing a web of relationships spanning 6 generations. She worked 16-hour days for 3 weeks, cross-referencing birth records, marriage certificates, death notices, and census data. Slowly, a picture emerged. The DNA belonged to someone descended from Johann and Greta Hollister, who'd arrived in Galveston in 1852 and moved inland to farm. Their descendants had spread across Texas, a sprawling family tree with hundreds of branches. But when Dr. Horn filtered for males who would have been between 25 and 60 years old in 1973 and who had lived in South Texas, the list narrowed dramatically. 3 men fit the parameters. One had died in 1989. Another had been living in California in 1973. The third was Wayne Edward Hollister, age 78, resident of Esperanza, Texas, for the past 46 years. Detective Mendoza spent the next week digging into Wayne Hollister's life, and the deeper she went, the stranger things became. On the surface, everything looked normal, almost aggressively normal. But underneath, there were gaps, inconsistencies, things that didn't quite add up. Wayne had moved to Esperanza in August 1970, 3 years before Daniel Thornton's disappearance. His job application at the Esperanza Cotton Cooperative listed his previous employment as Morris and Associates, a downtown Houston accounting firm. Mendoza called the firm. They'd been in business since 1952 and kept meticulous records. "No, ma'am," the office manager told her. "We've never had anyone named Wayne Hollister work here. I've been here since 1965, and I've seen every employee file we have. That name's not in any of them." Mendoza hung up and stared at her computer screen. Why would Wayne lie on a job application? Did the cooperative even check references back in 1970, or did they just take him at his word? She pulled Wayne's Social Security number from his tax records. It had been issued in 1969. That was odd. Most people born in 1941 would have gotten their Social Security numbers in childhood or at their first job in their teens or 20s. Why had Wayne gotten his at age 28? The Houston Police Department had interviewed several of Walter's co-workers and friends after his death. Most of them expressed shock. Walter hadn't seemed depressed. He'd been planning a fishing trip to Port Aransas. He'd just bought a new truck. But when Mendoza dug deeper into Wayne's background, she found a traffic accident report from August 1964. Marie Ellen Hollister, age 21, had been driving home from a date when her car went off a bridge. Wayne had been following behind her. The investigating officer noted that Marie's date said she'd been arguing with Wayne earlier that evening, telling him to leave her alone. Over the next 2 weeks, Mendoza found 4 unsolved sexual assault cases in East Texas between 1965 and 1969. All the victims were petite brunettes with long hair. All the attackers had worn thick glasses. All had called the victims Marie. One had apologized afterward, saying he didn't mean to hurt his sister. The pattern became clear. After Marie's death, Wayne had begun attacking young women who resembled her. By 1969, Wayne must have realized he was spiraling out of control. His father's suspicious death that year, followed by Wayne obtaining a new social security number and moving to a different city, suggested he was running from his past. And for 3 years in Esperanza, it seemed to work. But then, Sheriff Daniel Thornton began investigating a series of prowling incidents in early 1973. Someone was entering homes while women slept, standing in their bedrooms, then leaving. All the victims were petite brunettes with long hair. Daniel had been a thorough investigator. In his case notes from July 1973, he'd written, "Prowler appears fixated on specific woman type. Need to identify before behavior escalates to assault." Daniel was closing in on the pattern. And on August 14, 1973, Wayne Hollister decided he couldn't let that investigation continue. Mendoza knew she needed concrete evidence, not just circumstantial connections. She needed to confirm the DNA match directly from Wayne Hollister himself. She checked military records. No Wayne Edward Hollister had served in any branch. She pulled his birth certificate from Harris County records. Wayne Edward Hollister, born March 12, 1941, at Houston Methodist Hospital. Mother, Dorothy Hollister. Father, Walter Hollister. Then she found Walter Hollister's death certificate. He died in 1968, cause of death listed as suicide by gunshot. Mendoza tracked down the police report from that death. Walter Hollister had been found in his car in a remote area north of Houston, .38 revolver in his lap, single gunshot wound to the temple. But the investigating officer had noted something odd. Walter was left-handed, but the gun had been in his right hand. The case had been closed as suicide anyway, lacking evidence to prove otherwise. Mendoza felt the pieces beginning to align. She pulled Wayne's driver's license photo, then searched for older photos from 1970. She found one in the Esperanza High School yearbook from 1971, where Wayne had been featured in an article about new businesses in town. The face was younger, rounder, but recognizable. She ran that photo through facial recognition software, comparing it against databases of unidentified persons and unsolved crimes from the 1960s. And there it was, a match to a police sketch from Beaumont, Texas, circa 1967, connected to a sexual assault case that had never been solved. The victim had been a 23-year-old waitress who'd been attacked after her shift at a truck stop diner. She'd survived, but couldn't identify her attacker, except to say he'd worn thick glasses and had called her by the wrong name, as if he'd confused her with someone else. Mendoza expanded her search. Over the next 2 weeks, she found 3 more sexual assaults in East Texas between 1965 and 1969, all unsolved, all with similar MO: attacks on young women in isolated areas, perpetrator wearing glasses, victims reporting he seemed confused or disconnected from reality. One victim said her attacker had cried afterward and apologized, saying he didn't mean to hurt his sister. Wayne Hollister had a sister. Her name was Marie. She died in a car accident in 1964 when Wayne was 23. According to the police report, Marie had been driving home from a date when her car went off a bridge. Wayne had been following behind her in his own vehicle. He told police he'd tried to save her, but the car sank too quickly. But the investigating officer noted, Marie's date said she'd been arguing with Wayne at the restaurant earlier that evening. She'd told Wayne to leave her alone, that she was an adult and could date whoever she wanted. The pattern became clear. After Marie's death, Wayne had begun attacking young women who resembled her. Petite brunettes with long hair, usually in their early 20s. He'd call them Marie. He'd apologize. Then he'd assault them. By 1969, Wayne must have realized he was spiraling out of control. His father's suicide that year looked increasingly suspicious. Had Walter discovered what his son was doing? Had Wayne killed him to keep the secret? Shortly after Walter's death, Wayne Edward Hollister obtained a new Social Security number, likely using his father's identity documents to establish himself as a clean version of himself. He moved to Esperanza, a town where nobody knew him, where he could reinvent himself completely. And for 3 years, it seemed to work. Wayne kept his demons in check. He dated Sandra carefully, controlling himself. He made friends. He built a reputation. But then Sheriff Daniel Thornton began investigating a series of break-ins at women's homes in Esperanza. Nothing was ever stolen. The perpetrator just seemed to enter homes while women slept, stand in their bedrooms, then leave. Several victims had woken up to find someone standing over them, a figure that fled when they screamed. In August 1973, Daniel told Wayne about the investigation over coffee. He was frustrated, he said. He had no leads. The perpetrator was too careful. Wayne asked questions. Where had the break-ins occurred? What time of night? What did the women look like? Daniel showed him the case file, not thinking twice about sharing information with a trusted friend. That's when Wayne realized Daniel would eventually connect the break-ins to him. The victims all resembled Marie. The pattern would become obvious to someone as thorough as Sheriff Thornton. On August 14, 1973, Wayne called Daniel and asked to meet him at the courthouse after shift. He said he had information about the break-ins, that he'd seen something suspicious. Daniel agreed immediately. Wayne waited in the shadows behind the courthouse. When Daniel stepped out of his patrol car, Wayne approached from behind with a length of pipe he'd taken from his garage. One swift blow to the back of the head. Daniel fell without a sound. Wayne dragged him to his truck, parked in a nearby alley. He drove to the cotton field, to a spot he'd scouted earlier, and buried the body in a shallow grave. Then he returned Daniel's patrol car to the courthouse square, positioning it to look like the sheriff had simply stepped away and disappeared. The next morning, Wayne joined the search party that combed Esperanza for the missing sheriff. He consoled Margaret at the funeral. He lived his life, raised his family, became a model citizen. For 46 years, he believed he'd gotten away with it. Detective Mendoza presented her findings to the district attorney in April 2019. The genetic genealogy evidence, combined with the circumstantial evidence linking Wayne to the unsolved assaults and his father's suspicious death, was enough for an arrest warrant. On the morning of April 24, 2019, Detective Sarah Mendoza sat in an unmarked car half a block from Wayne Hollister's house on Magnolia Street, drinking terrible gas station coffee and watching the front door. She'd been there since 5:30 a.m., waiting for the right moment. The plan was simple. Approach Wayne at home, engage him in conversation, get him to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. If he refused, they'd tail him until he discarded something they could collect. A coffee cup, a cigarette butt, anything with his saliva or skin cells. The genetic genealogy evidence was strong enough for probable cause, but Mendoza wanted absolute certainty before making an arrest. At 7:15 a.m., Wayne's front door opened. He stepped out in his bathrobe and slippers, coffee mug in hand, and walked down his driveway to pick up the newspaper. He looked like every other retired man in Esperanza, harmless, ordinary, just another grandfather enjoying a quiet morning. Mendoza got out of her car and approached. "Mr. Hollister?" Wayne turned, startled. He squinted at her through his thick glasses, the same style of frames he'd been wearing for 50 years. "Yes? Can I help you?" "I'm Detective Sarah Mendoza with the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Department. I'd like to ask you a few questions about a cold case investigation we're conducting." Wayne's face went very still. His hand tightened on the coffee mug. "What case?" The disappearance of Sheriff Daniel Thornton in 1973. I understand you knew him. Yes, Daniel was a friend of mine. We had coffee together sometimes. That was a terrible tragedy. Wayne's voice was steady, but Mendoza noticed he'd taken a small step backward toward his house. Mr. Hollister, we've made a breakthrough in the case using DNA evidence. We've identified the person responsible. That's wonderful news. Daniel's family deserves answers after all these years. The thing is, Mr. Hollister, the DNA evidence points to someone in your family. Someone descended from Johann and Greta Hollister, who immigrated to Texas in the 1840s. I'm hoping you might be willing to provide a DNA sample to help us narrow down our search. Wayne stood very still for a long moment. Mendoza watched him carefully, looking for any sign of panic or flight response. But Wayne's face remained calm, almost unnaturally so. How does DNA work after so many years? Wayne asked quietly. The preservation conditions were excellent. We extracted skin cells from beneath the victim's fingernails. He fought back, scratched his attacker. That DNA was preserved in the soil for 46 years. Wayne nodded slowly. I see. Technology. I've read about genetic genealogy solving old cases. The Golden State Killer, wasn't it? That's right. And you think someone in my family tree killed Daniel Thornton? The evidence suggests it's someone very closely related to you, Mr. Hollister, which is why I'm asking for your cooperation. Wayne looked down at his coffee mug. Then he looked back up at Mendoza, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear, something closer to resignation, or maybe relief. I wondered when this day would come, he said softly. Technology, DNA. I knew someday it would catch up. I've been living with this for 46 years, Detective. 46 years of pretending, of being someone I'm not. Part of me is actually glad it's over. Mendoza felt her heart rate spike. Mr. Hollister, I need to advise you of your rights. I waive them, Wayne said. I'm 78 years old. I have heart disease. I don't have much time left anyway. I'm tired of running from what I did. He set down his coffee mug on the driveway and held out his wrists. You'll want to handcuff me, I imagine. Mendoza called for backup, then read Wayne his Miranda rights despite his waiver. She wanted everything done by the book, no technicalities that could compromise the case later. 2 patrol cars arrived within minutes, and officers placed Wayne under arrest. As they loaded him into the police car, Wayne looked back at his house. His wife Sandra was standing in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, not understanding what was happening. Wayne looked away from her without saying anything. At the sheriff's department, Mendoza sat across from Wayne in the interview room. A video camera recorded everything. Wayne's court-appointed attorney, Marcus Chen, sat beside his client, but Wayne had already stated he intended to confess. Tell me what happened on August 14th, 1973, Mendoza said. Wayne folded his hands on the table. Daniel was investigating prowling incidents, women reporting someone in their homes at night, standing in their bedrooms, watching them sleep. He talked to me about it. He was frustrated because he had no leads. Why did he talk to you about it? Because we were friends. We had coffee together at the Bluebonnet Café twice a week. He trusted me. He'd show me his case files sometimes, ask my opinion. He valued my perspective. What did you tell him? I asked questions. Where the incidents happened, what time of night, what the women looked like. And then I saw his face change. He was starting to see the pattern. All the victims were similar. Petite, brunette, long hair. Daniel was a smart man. He was starting to realize this wasn't random. Why did that concern you? Wayne was quiet for a moment. Because I was the prowler, Detective. I'd been going into those homes, standing over those women, watching them sleep. They all reminded me of my sister Marie. I never hurt them. I just needed to see them, to be near someone who looked like her. Tell me about Marie. Marie was 3 years younger than me. After our mother died, it was just the two of us and our father. I took care of her, made sure she was safe, loved her more than anything in the world. Wayne's voice cracked slightly. When she started dating, I couldn't handle it. The thought of her with another man, it made me crazy. We argued about it constantly. And then one night in 1964, I followed her home from a date. She was driving too fast, upset because we'd argued at the restaurant. Or maybe I was following too close. Maybe I forced her off the road. I honestly don't remember anymore. I've told myself so many versions of that night that I don't know which one is true. What happened after Marie died? I broke. Started seeing her everywhere, in every woman who looked like her. I'd follow them. Sometimes I'd approach them. Sometimes I'd hurt them. I couldn't help myself. My father figured it out eventually. I think that's why he died. I can't prove I killed him. But I remember arguing with him in his car. Remember him saying he was going to turn me in, and then the gun was in his hand and it went off. Or maybe I pulled the trigger. I don't know anymore. And then you moved to Esperanza. I got a new social security number, created a clean identity, moved somewhere nobody knew me. I thought I could start over, be normal. And for 3 years it worked. I met Sandra, got married, had a job. I controlled myself. But then the urges came back. The prowling started again. And Daniel was investigating it. So you killed him. I called him that night, told him I had information about the Prowler case, asked him to meet me at the courthouse after his shift. He trusted me, so he came. I waited behind the building with a pipe from my garage. When he got out of his car, I came up behind him and hit him as hard as I could. He died instantly, didn't suffer. That's something, I suppose. Where did you bury him? In a cotton field owned by the cooperative where I worked. I knew the area well. I'd scouted locations earlier, just in case. I drove his body out there in my truck, buried him in a shallow grave, then drove his patrol car back to the courthouse and walked home. It was less than 2 miles. Nobody saw me. And you lived here for 46 more years. Yes. I raised my children, loved my wife, served this community. I became the person I'd always wished I could be. But I was still the person who'd killed his friend because that friend was going to expose what I really was. Wayne looked directly at Mendoza. I'm not asking for mercy, detective. I know what I am. I'm a monster who wore a human mask for half a century. But I want you to know that Daniel Thornton was a good man who died trying to protect this town from someone like me. He deserves to be remembered for that. The confession was played at Wayne's arraignment the next day. The judge denied bail, citing flight risk and the severity of the crime. Wayne's wife, Sandra, filed for divorce within a week, telling reporters that the man she'd married didn't exist, that Wayne Hollister had been a fiction all along. The trial began on February 3, 2020, just weeks before the COVID-19 pandemic would shut down courts across the country. The prosecution presented the genetic genealogy evidence first, walking the jury through how Dr. Ellen Horn had built the family trees and identified Wayne as the only possible match. They brought in Mendoza to testify about the investigation, about Wayne's false work history, about his father's suspicious death, about the unsolved sexual assaults in East Texas that matched Wayne's MO. They played the video of Wayne's confession. The defense tried to argue that the confession was coerced, that Wayne had been in psychological distress when he confessed, that a 78-year-old man with heart disease wasn't thinking clearly. But the video showed Wayne calm, lucid, specific in his details. The confession was ruled admissible. Then the prosecution called the victims from the 1960s assaults. 2 of them were still alive: Jennifer Morrison, now 76 years old, and Patricia Chen, now 74. Both women testified about their attacks, about how the perpetrator had called them Marie, about how he'd worn thick glasses and had seemed to be acting out a script only he understood. "I've lived with that night for 53 years, Jennifer told the jury, her voice strong despite her age. "I've wondered who he was, why he chose me, whether he went on to hurt other women. Now I know. He did hurt other women, and he killed a good man who was trying to stop him." But the prosecution's most devastating witness was Sandra Hollister. Wayne's soon-to-be ex-wife took the stand on the 5th day of the trial. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the 9 months since Wayne's arrest. She testified about their 47-year marriage, about the man she'd thought she knew, about the secrets she'd discovered after his arrest. "After the police came, I searched our house," Sandra said. "Wayne had a locked box in his workshop. I'd seen it 1,000 times over the years, but he always said it was just old tax records and business files. After he was arrested, I found the key in his desk drawer." The prosecutor handed her an evidence bag. "Is this the box?" "Yes." "Can you tell the jury what was inside?" Sandra's hands shook as she opened the bag. Photographs, dozens of them. Young women, all with dark hair. Some were clearly taken through windows. Some showed women sleeping in their beds. I recognized several of them as women from Esperanza from years ago. Women I knew, women I'd taught with at the elementary school. She pulled out a leather journal. And this, Wayne's journal. He'd been keeping it since Marie's death in 1964. He wrote about his obsession with her, about how he couldn't save her, about how every woman he saw reminded him of her. And there was one entry from August 14th, 1973. "Can you read it to the jury?" Sandra opened the journal, her voice barely above a whisper. It says, "I did what had to be done. He would have figured it out eventually. He was too smart, too thorough. I couldn't go back to what I was before. This town made me clean. I won't lose that. Daniel was my friend, but I had no choice. I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. Does that make sense? I'm both." The courtroom was silent. Wayne sat at the defense table, staring at his hands, showing no reaction. Sandra closed the journal. "I was married to this man for 47 years. We raised 2 children together. He was kind to me, gentle. He coached Little League, served on the city council, volunteered at the fire department. Everyone thought he was wonderful, and the whole time he was hiding this. The whole time he'd killed Daniel Thornton and buried him in a cotton field. I don't know who Wayne Hollister really was. I don't think anyone does." The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: first-degree murder of Sheriff Daniel Thornton, with additional charges related to evidence tampering and concealment of a body. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge addressed Wayne directly. "Mr. Hollister, you took a good man from his family and his community. You buried him in an unmarked grave and left his loved ones to suffer for nearly half a century without answers. You lived among them, accepting their friendship and trust, all while hiding what you'd done. The sentence of this court is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Wayne showed no emotion as they led him away. But as he passed Margaret Thornton, who'd attended every day of the trial, he stopped and looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what it's worth, I really did consider Daniel a friend. He was a good man. Margaret stared at him, her face unreadable. Then she said, "You don't get to call him Daniel. You lost that right when you killed him." Wayne nodded and let the guards take him away. Margaret attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row with her daughter beside her. On the day of sentencing, reporters asked how she felt about the verdict. "I'm grateful," she said. "Grateful that my Daniel can finally rest in peace. Grateful that his killer will spend his remaining days in prison. But mostly, I'm grateful for Detective Mendoza, for Dr. Horn, for everyone who refused to let this case stay cold forever." She paused, looking out at the cameras. To anyone else out there with a missing loved one, with an unsolved case, don't give up hope. Justice can take decades, but it can still come. Technology changes, science advances, the truth eventually surfaces. Daniel Thornton was reburied with full honors in September 2020. This time the casket was not empty. Law enforcement officers came from across Texas to pay their respects. A honor guard fired a 21-gun salute. A helicopter flyover trailed ribbons in blue and gold, the colors of the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Department. Margaret placed a hand on the casket before they lowered it into the ground. "You can rest now," she whispered. "You can finally rest." Wayne Hollister died in prison in March 2023, at age 82, from complications of pneumonia. He never spoke publicly about the murder, never showed remorse, never explained why he'd killed the one man who'd shown him genuine friendship in Esperanza. Detective Mendoza, who'd stayed in touch with Margaret, called to inform her of Wayne's death. "How do you feel?" Mendoza asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I feel sad. Not for him, but for what could have been. If he'd gotten help after his sister died, if someone had seen his pain and intervened, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe Daniel would have lived to see his grandchildren grow up. Maybe those women in the 60s wouldn't have been assaulted. One person's untreated trauma cascaded through so many lives." "That's a compassionate way to see it," Mendoza said. "Daniel was compassionate," Margaret replied. "He believed everyone deserved a chance at redemption, but he also believed in accountability. Wayne had his chance. He chose to hurt people instead of getting help. He chose to kill my husband rather than face his demons. Those were his choices, and he paid for them in the end." Today, the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Department maintains a memorial to Sheriff Daniel Thornton in their headquarters. His badge is displayed in a glass case, along with one of his antique revolvers from his collection and a photo of him in full uniform, smiling at the camera with the Esperanza courthouse visible behind him. New deputies take their oath of service in front of that memorial. They're told Daniel's story, about the sheriff who disappeared and the detective who brought him home, about the importance of never giving up on a case, no matter how cold it gets. Margaret Thornton lived to be 87, passing away peacefully in her sleep in 2025. She was buried next to Daniel in the Catholic cemetery, their headstones finally united after 5 decades apart. Her obituary mentioned her work as a school secretary, her dedication to her daughter and grandchildren, and her role as an advocate for families of missing persons. But those who knew her best remembered her for something else: her unwavering belief that truth matters, that justice is worth waiting for, and that love endures beyond death, beyond decades, beyond even the grave. The new highway bypass around Esperanza opened in 2021, rerouting traffic away from the old town center. The spot where Daniel's body had been found is marked with a small memorial, a granite stone that reads, "Here, Sheriff Daniel James Thornton was found after 46 years. May truth always surface, and may justice never sleep." The cotton fields are gone now, replaced by solar farms and distribution centers. The old courthouse still stands, though it's been converted into a museum. Esperanza has grown to 20,000 residents, many of them newcomers who've never heard the story of the sheriff who vanished. But the old-timers remember. They remember the summer of 1973, when their sheriff disappeared and their sense of safety disappeared with him. They remember the decades of not knowing, of whispered theories and dead-end investigations. And they remember the moment in 2019 when Detective Mendoza held a press conference and announced that after 46 years, Sheriff Thornton was coming home. The case of Sheriff Daniel Thornton stands as a testament to the power of persistence, the advancement of forensic science, and the determination of investigators who refuse to let cold cases stay cold. It reminds us that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing when people refuse to stop looking for it. And it serves as a warning that evil can wear a friendly face, that monsters can live among us for decades undetected, but that eventually, inevitably, science and perseverance will expose them to the light. In the end, Daniel Thornton got his justice. It took 46 years, but he got it. And in a small town in South Texas, that matters more than words can express.